It's been a while since I've had anything to talk about. Mainly, I've been buried at work, working on this sort of AI project. So that sort of put things on hold with my whole MMO. Even though I got to a kind of a certain point where I felt like it could kind of be a success if I continued working on it. But work kind of took over because I've gotten really heavily into this context engineering thing, and that's also something that applies to like my day job as well. The topic of context engineering has kind of taken over in the last, I don't know, 5 to 6 months in AI. There used to be this sort of idea called prompt engineering that was really important, and then it kind of has morphed into context engineering when people started to kind of realize the limitations of LLMs when it came to long running processes, which is ultimately what we want them to do. Right, like everybody kind of like dreams about the vibe coding sort of, oh, I just say, hey, build this app, but that app takes time to build. And as it turns out, the longer a task runs, the more corrupted the context becomes. And so finding out ways to have long running LLM tasks, or like, say, for instance, an LLM that's sitting there constantly monitoring, running jobs or some sort of deployment and triaging issues, that's not really working out because long running tasks are sort of a bit of a problem. And sort of the main problems that you get with long running tasks are, you get, some people call it context rot generally, but you get a series of problems. First, you can get this thing called context poisoning, and that's when your model makes an inference based on a couple of facts that's actually kind of wrong. Maybe it's a hallucination, and then it starts using that particular incorrect inference or hallucination in other now incorrect inferences, and it just sort of like uh, piles out of control. Some other things are like context confusion, and that's when you sort of have facts that don't really apply to what you're doing, but they can kind of end up influencing the inference in a negative way. You have sort of context clashing. That is when you have two sort of competing inferences or two sort of competing facts that actually kind of like mutually exclude each other, like always do X and never do X. And so you have a problem where the model can't really decide which one is right, when really you've kind of like made that a problem in the context by not really thinking about like always do X but only in these three cases, and always do Y in these other cases. So just sort of like poorly formed contexts can become like context clashing. And then I guess, yeah, there's probably a couple of others, but those are the main sort of issues. And so also there's some additional problems that aren't really necessarily covered by that. And it just happens that like when you start a context, you have like a context window, say it's like, X number of tokens, like Claude 4.5 is like 200,000 tokens. And so you start the context and you put, all the interesting information that you want to set up your context in. And then the context starts expanding. And it's like the further away that the context expands from that original information, the more likely it is that the agent will kind of forget to do things, forget directives, forget tool accesses, forget rules and statements that you established early on. And sometimes people call it like a lost in the middle problem, but it's not really that. It's more like a distance problem. The greater the distance between the initial setup of the context and where you're at can have very deleterious effects on the outcome. And this leads me to always say things like the context is a lie. Like whatever context window a company is selling you for their particular LLM, you can probably effectively use maybe 40 to 50% of that context before you start seeing significant degradation. It's probably actually a lot less. I have seen some graphs and some models from people that show that, like, say for instance, like after 32,000 to like 40,000 tokens in a context, the performance starts to degrade, the number of errors start to really crop up. So you're really in a sense, like tokens are not really mapped to words, but say for instance, your average sort of short novella is about 40,000 words, maybe 50,000 words. So, I mean, it is a lot of context that you can work with. Like it's enough for you to describe a single discrete task. And so that kind of leads to the current project that I've been working on for a while, both like on my MMO. And then once I kind of realized that that worked, I decided to start like trying to apply it at my job as well. Those things that I learned, which is this sort of breaking up your project into a plan, and then breaking up your plan into discrete steps, and then actually just sort of like executing those steps in an iterative kind of way so that you're actually not poisoning your context even with the entire plan, because that's one thing that can definitely happen. Like a lot of people like, hey, make a plan and then use multiple agents, sub agents, to like execute the plan. That doesn't really work out all that good because you come up with the same problems, especially any sufficiently granular plan for a sufficiently large sort of piece of software is just not going to work. So you're going to have to like chop it up to even smaller pieces and then find some way to like feed that to an LLM at one task at a time to get it to complete them. And so that's basically kind of like what I've been working on over the last couple weeks. I haven't really gotten there quite yet because one of the problems that I've encountered is that the current design of things like Claude, Claude CLI, and most CLIs don't really lend themselves well to this workflow. They're not really context control or context engineering friendly. They're really trying to like get you to chat with the model and interact with the model and ultimately like spend as many tokens as possible. They're not really set up for you to create sort of complex workflows where you control the context at every step. And that's sort of like the thing that I've been working on. Is like how can we either modify these existing CLIs in such a way that we can get this behavior, or whether or not we have to design a new one that is more context aware. So I put a drawing up on the screen. I tried to get uh, Gemini to make this. It didn't quite get it, so I had to end up editing it in Photoshop. So if you see like some small little artifacts, it's because I did a quick Photoshop edit. But the general idea here is that you come up with some sort of plan and you just can't execute the plan if it's sufficiently large. Sometimes you can, but if it's a sufficiently large plan, you actually have to split it up into steps and you have to execute those steps in isolation of the plan. And then I have this sort of concept of like the base context. So this is like the minimum context needed to execute that step. And that's kind of like that little blue cyan portion. And then the pink is like once you start executing the step, you start with like this much context, say 20%. And then as it completes the task, it's going to fill up that context. But you'll see with each one of these steps, it always starts with the base context necessary for the step. And then it fills it up based on, whatever complex thing that it's doing. And then when we go to the next step, we have a completely fresh base context to work from. And this helps you to avoid the context rot, the context confusion, context poisoning that happens on long running workflows. And of course, in this case, like base context is like some sort of shared memory file out to the file system, or is possibly put up there. I mean, there are more complex things to do. Like say, for instance, each step maybe needs to create like a record of what it did in the previous step, and that needs to be added into the base context. So the base context can kind of grow over time. But as a general rule, my opinion is that um, really the only thing that we need is a memory of the previous step. You don't actually need to know all the previous steps that have done. You just need to know what was the last step that we did. Like, was there anything interesting or unique about what we did in the last step? That's probably a way to work. And that's kind of the system I'm designing now is like, how do we create a plan? And then once we have that plan, how do we separate that plan into individual steps and program in the context that will be necessary and the means to sort of find additional context to solve the problem? And then just do that in like this loop. And they have a name for the loop. They call it the Ralph Wiggum,
I'm in danger.
which is so called because if you run it like this, you're seriously in danger of just running off crazy and ending up costing yourself a lot of money in tokens, basically, which is probably why they called it the Ralph Wiggum. The original Ralph Wiggum was really just sort of like keep running it in a loop. My kind of way of designing it is like, okay, well, we know how many steps we need to take, so let's not run it too many times. And if it doesn't complete in that number of steps, then we can debug from there. And we just need to kind of like track like what did it complete, and then figure out what to do from there. So it's slightly less dangerous, but the original name of it was the Ralph Wiggum for that reason. And of course, with this model that we're basically talking about. we have this base context. You kind of want to burn as many tokens as possible using like ultrathink and as much time as possible to make that context um, very good and complete. You don't want to include code in there, but you want to include like lots of file references and where to look for things, so that for each step, when it loads that base context up, it kind of like it can figure out how to find what it needs to find. So yeah, that's the basic idea of what I've been working on. Just a quick little update. I'll probably have more. Maybe I'll have more of a specific design that I can show at some point. Um, but until then,